Underpinning the abolition of work is a long-standing narrative about the human species and its development over time. This narrative has found expression across a diverse range of fields, including anthropology, philosophy, art, and even religion. In fact, you might say it's one of the oldest stories ever told. It goes something like this. At one point in our species' history, in fact, for most of our species' existence on Earth, human beings lived in harmony with one another and with the environment. Our desires were fewer, our needs were simpler, and for those very reasons, we lived in a state of perpetual satisfaction and general peace. Most importantly, we were free in two senses of the word. Positively speaking, we were free to do pretty much whatever we liked. Negatively speaking, we were free from the kinds of constraints which are present in, well, the kinds of societies that we have today. At some point, or perhaps more accurately over some period of time, we traded all of that peace and satisfaction for certain things that maybe we thought we needed. Perhaps we were coaxed into accepting them, possibly by someone or something that wanted to control us. But this exchange was made under false pretenses. We already had everything we needed. And whatever we might have gained as a result of this exchange pales in comparison to what we've lost, what we've left behind. If this story sounds familiar, it should. This is the story of how human beings shifted from their so-called primitive life to so-called civilized life. Or perhaps I should say it's a story. It's one account of this transition. It's a particular interpretation of our species' history, one which holds that the shift to civilization from so-called primitivity has not been an improvement. Actually, it's been kind of more like a regression than progression. What we've lost as a result of this shift on this particular view, what we've lost far outweighs what we've gained. From transitioning from, say, hunting and gathering to living in atomizing cities, having governments tell us what to do, one of those things being working in order to earn a living. So according to this narrative, whatever we might like to call it, our primitive world of the past was vastly superior to the one we have now in civilized society. In other words, there was some previous state of affairs which we've left behind, a lost world, so to speak, where all of the problems we face today are basically absent, and in which we enjoyed a kind of freedom that is really inaccessible today. For some, this notion of a lost world is itself only part of the picture. Some believe very strongly that we ought to do our best to reverse this so-called progression, this process from primitivity to civilization, whether that means just individually going off and joining like a co-op or something, or perhaps something more radical and more widely encompassing, like upending the way one's society is structured altogether. For someone who holds to such a view, particularly this latter view, which implicates lots of people, not just individuals, the transition from primitivity to civilization was not progress. Progress would be going back to the way things were. If we can somehow get back to the way things used to be, we will be righting the ship, so to speak, because as of right now, we're completely off course. We are not where we ought to be as human beings. To hold to such a view of what we ought to do, and to ground this view in this lost world interpretation of human history, is to endorse something that is qualitatively different from the mere observation that there are certain pros and cons of the old way and the new way. This is a little bit more than that. No, to couple this narrative about our own species' history with a related prescription for what we ought to do moving forward is to endorse a particular ideology, one which makes its presence known in a variety of fields, which goes by a number of different names. In history and anthropology, for example, you may see scholars use terms like primitivism or antiquarianism to describe works which are taken to idealize the past, usually to an extent that goes well beyond the facts of the matter. I think that there is some overlap between what these terms convey and some of the ideas that Bob Black espouses in his own essay. But I do want to say one thing. Beyond what I think are some important overlaps between Black's work and the scholarship that's been built up around, say, primitivism, I think there are enough important differences between what Bob Black actually believes and what such a term like primitivism usually conveys that has actually kind of led me away from wanting to associate this term with his work very closely. One reason for this is that terms like primitivism and antiquarianism are almost always used derogatorily, as derogatives. So that's kind of not really fair to Black, right? Because if we're introducing terms in connection to his work that are usually pejorative, we're already off to a bad start. I'm already putting a bad taste in people's mouths who might not be very familiar with Black's work and would come away with a rather biased interpretation, which I want to try and avoid as much as possible. So that's what led me to try and come up with some alternative term to use to describe Black's views and the views of a number of other scholars and other lines of thought. One that I think is able to accommodate Black's well-documented aversion to being pigeonholed. We certainly want to respect that, of course. But it also allows us to see how his paper fits, I think, very nicely in with a much longer-standing body of work, something which I have chosen to call the Lost World ideology. There are two components to this Lost World ideology. First, there is the narrative or descriptive component, which tells a story about who we once were as a species, what things used to be like, and most importantly, that this previous state of affairs was more ideal, was better than the way things are now. This then is the story of the lost world. Second, this is what makes it ideological, properly speaking, there is a prescriptive component, the political component, if you prefer, which makes this more than just a story. This is where we have someone saying, not only was this past state of affairs better than what we have at present, but that we can and ought to try and go back, in some sense, to this past state of affairs. If not literally go back, that our vision of the future should at the very least be informed quite heavily by looking into the past for guidance. Thus, the descriptive component of this ideology grounds the prescriptive component, the description of what things used to be and what they're like now, the qualitative differences between those two, where one is superior to the other, coupled with this idea that we can or ought to have a do-over, try and model society in some way that is more resembling of the way it used to be, before we had civilization itself. Taken together, these constitute what is an ideology of some kind, one which is informed by this idea that the past was somehow better than the present. It takes what is otherwise a interesting and perhaps controversial interpretation of the past and molds it into a vision of the future. I think I've said a few times already that this is a long-standing narrative, that this is a tale as old as time. At this point, an example is likely warranted. One of the earliest iterations of this narrative that I can think of took the form of a story that I was told when I was very young. Perhaps you were told a similar story as well. It's the story of two people, a garden, and a talking snake. In this story, the two people, a man and a woman, are coaxed into procuring something that they were forbidden from taking, specifically a fruit from a particular tree. And when they ate this fruit, they were expelled from the garden, where they had previously been living in peace and perpetual satisfaction. Now they've been thrown into this harsh, unforgiving world with all these new conditions placed upon them that weren't there before. Perhaps the most apropos of those being, given our subject of this series, you shall toil all the days of your life. That's one of the conditions that's placed on them. In other words, you shall work. That's what they get in exchange for eating of the fruit. And here we have one of the earliest instances, at least in the Western canon, on which human beings are believed to have lost something that they once had, that they have, so to speak, fallen from some kind of grace. Some might say that this narrative, not the Garden of Eden specifically necessarily, but at least the form that structures such an account, is embedded somewhere deep in our unconscious. Not just the Jungian archetypal stuff either. This lost world narrative is in some ways analogous to the fantasy articulated by psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan of going back to some state in which we were desireless, in which there was a gapless satisfaction of our needs. Basically, this is the fantasy of going back, well, into the womb. This is, of course, the definition of perversion, right? Going against nature, doing things backwards, trying to get back somewhere that you cannot go. That's the direction of perversion. When we're born, and particularly when we become self-conscious, we understand that this is me and the world is external, it's something separate, including other people. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into a whole Lacanian wormhole right now, but just some very basic points I want to make here. Is that a basic assumption of a lot of Lacan's work is that once we become aware of this separation between self and other, we enter the symbolic. Once we're in it, there we shall remain. We're cut off in the same way that the other tree in the garden, the tree of eternal life, is guarded by a flaming sword that spins in every direction, so no getting in. We're out of the garden, and out of the garden we shall remain. But we keep trying to get back in. That's kind of what causes so many problems for us, right? It's kind of the basis of a lot of the need for stuff like psychoanalysis, presumably at least. We can't get back to the real, Lacan would say. In other instances, he might say there never was a sense in which we were ever had access to the real. However you want to slice it, it's kind of the same result. There's some fantasy of a lost object, right, that we are pining after, looking for in all kinds of things. The list is quite literally infinite because everything has the potential of standing in for this lost object, but none of them are really it. And the reason none of them are the object is not because it's unattainable. That's too easy. Lacan doesn't make it easy for us. He says, no, you never had the object to begin with. So whether you want to say we were never in the garden, or if we were, we can't get back in, the point is that there is this idea somewhere in here of having lost something. And actually what Lacan says that is really, I think, one of his most important contributions to this idea is that the very myth of having lost something is something we've come up with ourselves, when in fact we never had it to begin with. That's one perspective. Happily, there are some less obscure places we can look, besides the depths of the unconscious, that is, where this idea of a cutoff point between primitive people and civilized people and all that that entails is not just articulated quite explicitly, but is presented as being nothing short of a marvel. Like, thank God we got out of that previous state of affairs. And this, well, I guess he wouldn't have said thank God, but he would have been very grateful nonetheless. And this comes in with 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes.